sustainability in action. First, I would like to dive a bit into what ESMAP is. It is one of the oldest trust funds in the World Bank, and it was established all the way back in 1983 to respond to the global energy crisis of the 1970s. And now it has become a partnership between the World Bank and 20 partners. And it aims to help low and middle income countries reduce poverty and boost growth through sustainable energy solutions. And through that, we provide both analytical and advisory services to our bank teams and then also to our clients. ESMAP is actually fully integrated with the World Bank's country financing and policy dialogue in the energy sector so that it contributes to shape the World Bank Group strategies and programs to achieve these different objectives. In 2025, we started our new business plan, which is split into 3 areas of focus: energy access, foundations, and energy transition. And as you may have deduced, under energy transition, you can also find the hydropower program, where we seek to build a portfolio of pipeline of sustainable hydropower projects. And we also support countries to develop and manage both in terms of existing hydropower plants, but also to develop new greenfield plants, or if there is any rehabilitation needs, etc. Another one of our objectives is also to accelerate deployment of hydropower that is critical for variable renewable integration. Our approach is split into 2 tracks, and one is where we have our upstream engagement. This is where ESMAP can support planning and capacity building efforts in a country, where we aim to put the framework in place that could further develop hydropower in that country or region. We also support project-specific engagements that will usually design with the maximizing finance for development principles, where the bank support focus on de-risking project preparation and or construction and to demonstrate sustainable impact. As part of our work in ESMAP as well, we have also, about a year ago, we published a report called Power and Flexibility and Facilitating the Energy Transition with Hydropower Hybrid Solutions. The aim of this report is to explore how you can leverage the capabilities of hydropower to support increasing shares of variable renewables in the power system. It explores different combinations of technologies, and also it introduces a framework for how to place and interpret those technologies in terms of what they provide from the hydropower plant or hybrid plant's perspective when it comes to flexibility and how that translates into power systems. So with the figure you can see here, you can see that on the left you have 3 indicators called in energy services. One is energy control, second is energy storage, and the third is energy generation. All of these 3 are crucial elements in terms of what a hydropower or hybrid plant can contribute to the power system and what we need at all times. So energy control is usually when it comes how to you manage your fluctuations in frequency or voltage and so on, so that you maintain a short-term balance in the power system at all times. So one example is then how you can use fast response hydropower to enhance your energy control capabilities. And then if you read this framework, you can see that this is under technologies up on the left. And then it translates to the right that it works on best supports on a time scale that is in seconds to hour. so that it supports the power system flexibility indicator under power. So it's maintaining a balance there as well. The other technologies here as well, they also support the other ones under power system, but on quality, etc. When it comes to ensuring access to energy for short or middle time scale to long time scale, you can see with seasons and years, etc. That's where you start evaluating what kind of energy storage technology you have incorporated in your plant and how that also contributes to balancing energy generation from variable renewables. So with this report, our main message is that energy service could incentivize deployments in regions with weak grids or high VRE shares. And hydropower can then provide the dispatchable high quality power and balance these types of load changes. Today's webinar is to discuss about the role of hydropower to provide increased flexibility and storage across these different timescales and how that can manage the integration of wind and solar energy. I'm joined today by two very distinguished presenters. So first, we will hear from Dr. Abhishek Tsunami. He is the principal economist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and we'll discuss how to manage increasing challenges in the system, and then especially with a focus on what can be expected to happen when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, or in cases where you have a large surplus of renewable generation. After that, we will hear from Rebecca Ellis. She's a Senior Energy Policy Manager at IHA, and she will talk about how hydropower can contribute to support power system flexibilities and so on, but from the perspective of IHA. And by that, I would like to welcome Abhishek to start his presentation, and hear from him. While he does that, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we will post a poll in the chat during this webinar, and we kindly request that you fill in that one. At the end of Abhishek's presentations, we will also have a Q&A, and then we will follow up with Rebecca and have a Q&A after her as well. So please post your questions in the chat and we will try to address as many of them. So Abhishek, please take over.
Thank you, Benta, for the introduction. And I apologize in advance. My voice is still a little hoarse. I'm dealing with a persistent and stubborn cold for the last week or so. But with that, yeah, apart from being at PNNL, where I've been for the last 13 years now, this work that I'm going to present was done under the banner of IEA Hydro, which is the Hydropower Technology Collaboration Program at the IEA, but supported by the US DOE. I'll talk about some work we did and published last year, which is dealing with at least with the energy shortage periods, energy drought, or the Dunkelflaute kinds of events that we did under the IEA Hydro program last year. So with that, all right, so I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for this work, which is we've seen there's been a significant growth and deployment in energy storage, but that's been mostly in the 4 to 6 hour duration. The business case seems to be well established by now, which is providing ancillary services of different types, but the ancillary services markets themselves are quite thin. These are services of different types, like Benta was talking about. These are capacity services and ancillary services, and also in some cases providing firm power as well. There are emerging niche cases with energy storage, as we've seen in some parts, which is things like co-locating storage with conventional power. conventional generation, and this can help with increasing capacity or adding flexibility. Again, so certain things that Benta mentioned, like co-locating a battery with run-of-river hydro to increase both the capacity and the flexibility of those resources. It can also actually help with increasing the longevity of the machines themselves by taking away the stress and by reducing things like start stops, which can reduce the wear and tear on the machine parts. But the thing that we really want to concentrate on and talk about, at least in this webinar, is the long duration energy storage. And the need we may as we that it still feels a little distant, but I think it's closer than we can imagine, because as we're seeing already, there are a significant number of events of these the so-called Dunkelflaute events, where there's energy deficit from both wind and solar, either independently or even in tandem together. And these energy droughts are only likely to be exacerbated as we have even greater penetrations of renewables in the future. So I'll concentrate on that and present a few examples, primarily from the US, but also just making a note that we've done this study for a lot of international regions as well. And there's going to be a link to the report. And finally, capping off with what's needed to actually build new pump storage or other long duration storage devices. As we know that there are more than, at least in the US, there are more than 90 FERC licenses. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has granted licenses, which is a painstaking process. It takes a number of years, a lot of time and money goes into acquiring these licenses. But then we're seeing not a lot of projects getting built. So basically talking about like where is the gap between the need that we're seeing and the actual building of new pump storage facilities. And this can apply for other capital intensive resources as well. So I'll kick this off with a little motivating example from the US. This is a heat wave event that we saw in primarily the Western United States, the Southwestern United States, which is California primarily, but then also parts of Oregon and Arizona in the West. Where there were above average temperatures for a number of days, and that's represented by the dotted line, the vertical dotted line in the graph on the right. And the temperatures rose, and with that, there was definitely increase in the total demand, the electrical demand in the system. But then a couple of things happened concurrently. This is a figure from the total generation in the Pacific Northwest region now, which exports a lot of energy into California and the Southwest. So a couple of things happened simultaneously. First thing we noticed was wind just dropped down to zero before right at the outset of the event. Now again, as you can imagine, wind speeds are weather dependent. So with above average, both at above average temperatures and below average temperatures, you have certain impact on wind speeds, and then that can lead to the change in output. So that's basically what we saw. The wind output just dropped down to zero. So that was a double whammy, right? So we had increased loads, almost zero wind. So from almost 2,000 megawatts down to zero. But then what we noticed was the hydropower production ramped up right at the outset of the event. So picking up almost the slack, right? So 2,000 megawatts of wind dropped down to zero, and we saw a 2,000 megawatt increase in the daily generation of the hydropower facilities in the Northwest. So that speaks to a lot of stored energy a lot of energy that had to have been stored behind the reservoirs, and along with the physical ability to ramp up to those levels. So that's basically what we saw, and hydropower, along with other resources, came to the rescue during this event. So this is hydropower in action, the flexibility of hydropower in action during an extreme in a weather event, but also the need for having this amount of stored energy in the system to help ride through events of this type. And we're seeing an increasing frequency of these kinds of atypical weather events occurring not just in the US, but also elsewhere in the world. So this basically talks about the need for increasing need for long duration stored energy in the system. So that was basically one of the biggest motivators for the study that we did, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology that we employed in the study at the IEA Hydro, which is to identify and quantify the Dunkelflaute events. So this figure on the right, figure basically shows our methodology for identifying the wind drought events. And basically, the basic idea was we looked at any given 4-hour period, and this is only for historical events with using historical data. We started with any 4 consecutive hours and looked at the wind output in those 4 consecutive hours, and then compared that with a reference period, which is either the entire year of wind generation or a more recent, for just 15 days prior and 15 days later. So looking at a 30-day window to look at the wind output in that reference period and compared it with that 4-hour period of interest. If the generation, the wind output in that 4-hour period was below the 10% of the average for the reference period, then we would call it a Dunkelflaute. We would identify that as an event. So just to give you an example, if in a 30-day period the average wind output is, let's say, 100 megawatts, and for any given 4-hour period within that 30-day period, if the generation was less than 10 megawatts, we would call that Dunkelflaute. We would call that as an energy drought event. And then we would just expand on that. So we would start with that 4-hour period. If the 4-hour period is identified as a energy drought, we would increase it by an hour until after a certain period of time you don't have the energy generation below 10%. So that was the basic methodology we employed. The idea was to look at extreme energy drought events, which is why we chose that 10% threshold. But we can for different systems that threshold could vary. To just give you a couple of examples from the U.S. These are 2 areas that we looked at in the U.S. One's roughly corresponding to Texas, and the other roughly corresponding to the state of California. In this period of the study, which was from 2018 to 2020 for the U.S., we identified a total of 82 such events in Texas itself, and then 167 events in California. To give you some idea of the impact of these energy droughts, this figure on the left shows 2 sets of bar charts. The blue chart shows how much the renewables contribute to load during the non-drought events. So basically the normal periods, which is anywhere from 20 to 25% of the energy, right? But during the energy drought events, that contribution drops down to less than 2%. So that's a significant amount of energy shortfall, right? So almost 20% energy, 20% shortfall in terms of the energy served by renewables or the demand served by renewables. So that's a significant amount of gap that we're seeing in terms of the energy droughts, the impact of energy droughts. This is just with historical penetration, right? This is we're talking about 10, 15, 20% penetration of renewables. So you can imagine like how the situation could be exacerbated further if the penetrations go up to 40%, 50%, 60%, as are being talked about. And if I just want to focus in on this one specific event, what we call the longest event in Texas, which was about 15-hour event, and that corresponded to a total energy deficit of about 150 megawatt hours. If we just look at this in terms, like just to put this in perspective, this event would require 10 plants of 1,000 megawatt capacity running at 15 hours straight, right? So that's a significant amount of capacity shortfall to be dealing with, or capacity requirement to be dealing with these kinds of energy shortfalls. Now we know this happened in the past, and the systems were able to ride through these events, so there was nothing that untoward came from these events. But the question is, what happens if you have more retirements or other kinds of or greater or increasing penetration of renewables, which can further exacerbate the situation. So these are plants where you can also substitute this with, just for the sake of argument, say if this was going to be a 1,000 megawatt battery, we're talking about a 15-hour battery of 1,000 megawatts capacity, and then 10 of those batteries. So just to put that in perspective, that's the kind of shortfall we're talking about. There's a flip side of this equation that we also want to talk about, and we've only recently started looking at that under again the IEA Hydro work, is to look at the energies, the surplus situations, which is basically because of curtailments that are happening for a variety of reasons. So again, I'll use California as an example, but we're doing the study for multiple regions in the world. And by the way, just like this, we did the Dunkelflauder study that we did was for more than 12 regions in the world. That was US, Canada, multiple countries in the EU, and then also Australia. We also looked at both wind droughts, the wind energy droughts, solar energy droughts, and for wind, we also looked at the offshore wind energy droughts. So for the surplus, basically starting with looking at again observed data and looking at curtailments from around the world, what we're seeing, and this is an example from California again, we're seeing a steady increase and quite substantial increase in the amount of curtailments, and this is primarily solar in California, which is the dominant renewable source. And this graph only goes on to January 2024 and 2022, and we were already seeing curtailments in the region in the amount of 500,000 megawatt hours in certain months. I pulled out a more recent graph for data for California, and basically that number is almost doubled in 2025 already. We saw curtailments of 900,000 megawatt hours in California, right? So that presents, and this is the prevailing the planning paradigm, right? Overbuild and curtail. And to some extent, that's the cheaper option. That's why we're doing this. But this can also present as an opportunity, right? If there was enough storage, long duration stored energy, energy storage resources, all of this curtailed energy could be stored. And again, just to give you an example, just to put this in perspective, 900,000 megawatt hours would amount to 9 pump storage facilities, again, each of 1,000 megawatt capacity of 10-hour duration, right? So we're talking about 9,000 megawatt batteries of 10-hour duration. So that's the scale of stored and storable energy that is already available. If the business case were to make sense. Now, the business case really doesn't pan out for long duration stored energy, and that's basically what I'm going to be capping off this presentation with. Like I said, we're doing this for, again, the study for Australia. We're going to expand it to the EU and other places as well, looking at the amount of surplus energy that's available for that could be stored in long duration storage assets. So key takeaways is we're seeing these atypical extreme weather events happening and happening more frequently and of different types. I only touched on the heat wave events. We can also talk about the polar vortex events in certain cases, and the story is quite similar. And these things happen, and then it concurrently impacts not just the total electrical demand, but impacts these weather-dependent renewable energy production as well, and can lead to substantial amount of energy shortfalls, even though there's enough installed capacity, like we're seeing, with the curtailed and the surplus energy that's available. Hydropower, where available, we've got numerous examples of hydropower providing all of these essential reliability services, including the long duration stored energy that's required to ride through these events. But what we're seeing is that systems are increasingly limited in energy and not capacity. This can point to maybe some shortcomings in the way the kind of regulatory paradigm is structured. So the resource adequacy, which is basically the prevailing, at least in the U.S., the planning paradigm that ensures that there's enough capacity to meet all of the different requirements. That's primarily based on capacity and not energy. Just okay. You want me to wrap it up again? Yeah, I'm almost done. Yeah. So basically, the point is that the resource adequacy assessments should be more energy-based as opposed to capacity-based. And then maybe, and Rebecca's going to touch a little more on this as well, that the market and the regulatory and the policy paradigms need to basically adapt as well to make a viable case for long-duration energy storage. Arbitrage and conventional ancillary services-based revenues are good, but they're not enough to make a case for the long-duration storage. And we're seeing some new examples of new service models like storage as a service model, which is coming up in places like Switzerland. And I can talk more about this during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. I think that we do share a passion for discussing these types of topics, and we can continue on much further. But I think that we also would like to invite Rebecca to give her presentation. And I think that since these presentations are very close together in terms of topic, we will save the Q&A round till last so that we can really try to dive into the different perspectives from both presenters. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Binta. And thank you, Abhishek. I always find the presentation on the Dunkelfeld data fascinating. It just shows that we need much more of this flexibility so that we can avoid curtailment. And on the Australian context, I think it's fascinating on the daily. There's negative pricing daily across multiple markets within their national electricity market. So it's a really interesting time. There's definitely more energy storage needed globally. But a little bit about IHA. So IHA, International Hydropower Association, is a nonprofit membership association. We are the global voice of sustainable hydropower, and our mission is to advance and increase the investment in sustainable hydropower, which is backed by something known as the Hydropower Sustainability Standard, which is a certification method which has been approved and follows many non-governmental organizations and had many NGOs involved in its creation, as well as we issued the San Jose Declaration saying that hydropower is a clean, green, modern, affordable solution to climate change. And going forward, the only acceptable hydropower should be sustainable as driven and as indicated by the Hydropower Sustainability Standards. So just a little bit about IHA. As many of you already probably know, we need to triple up renewables. We need to increase and the world is doing so at a pace and scale unimaginable from a decade ago. At COP28, we saw that tripling up target become very much called for. And hydropower will definitely be needed to grow at a vast quantity, nearly a doubling figure, to be able to support this variable renewable energy target because of its dispatchability nature. as part of this, in addition, at this most recent COP, many of you may be aware that there was a long duration energy storage target for net zeros, which was called upon for the by the Long Duration Energy Storage Council, as well as the IHA, which welcomed governments looking at this as part of the COP29 pledges. But as you'll see, that maximum required storage duration goes up by quite the scale, as it's 10, 100, 1,000 hours based on how much variable renewable energy is actually within the overarching system. So we're definitely going to need, especially with storage with 100 plus hour durations, is needed as we reach 90 plus wind and solar generation. So that flexibility, that longer duration energy storage, which Abhishek talked about, we anticipate, and we've seen the modeling for, will definitely be needed. So getting to what hydropower's role is today, as Abhishek touched on a little bit, it involves electricity production, including that stable, reliable baseload that we've seen and we loved across the globe since its inception. We also see storage capacity, so its ability to pump excess electricity, whether that be from a nuclear fleet or variable renewable energy on a sunny or a windy day, and provide that surplus energy when the grid is needed, both in short bursts and longer term energy storage. Critically as well, grid regulation, that instantaneous power regulation and to control and stabilize the electric power system, which we've seen time and time again. And as Abhishek noted, with those long duration energy storage droughts is something that you have to think about short-term grid regulation, but that long-term energy storage. So hydropower will play an important and critical role from all of its technology types. So what does this mean in terms of power versus flexibility? So that, as Bente touched on, we see inertia as that sort of sub-second. It's very much in line with that kinetic energy that's stored in rotating mass, which I'll touch on shortly. But then we have that longer duration, which can be stored for hours or days or even years. Power flexibility, that quick yank that the grid might need in terms of just to maintain its synchronization. And then energy flexibility, which is that sustained and steady extra set of hands to keep that stable energy, thinking about it as sort of balancing consumption and production in constant flows, like a like a tug of war, as it were. So hydropower's role in that short-term flexibility, as you can see, this is actually a graph taken from the ENSO-E, so that's the European Transmission System Operator Group from Spain a few days ago. And we can see there was a huge amount of solar and wind on the system. And at the time, there was also a huge amount of pumping taking place to sort of balance it. And they were also selling it to their neighbors as well. And hydropower's role in both Spain and beyond in many countries is to provide that spinning and fast ramping to support variable renewables as they come online. They're able to tailor their operations accordingly. Frequency control, which I'll touch on shortly, rotating inertia to maintain and to that quick yank, as we noted, and that reactive power control as well. So, but just quickly touching on reduced system inertia, we're seeing this as more variable renewable energy comes online. There is actually less system inertia in some places. And so it's just the importance of making sure that there is some dispatchability or something that can provide that sort of rotating system inertia. So it's that spinning generators that are able to resist drops in frequency. So not to say that we don't want to phase out fossil fuels, we definitely do, but just to make sure that there's that dispatchable, either synthetic or synchronous inertia that's able to provide that power system what it needs. So just to flag in terms of blackout capabilities, this was a near black. This wasn't a total blackout, fortunately. In the UK in 2019, there was a lightning strike on a transmission asset, which was a CCGT, an offshore wind farm, and it caused a trip in frequency, which led to a sort of brownout of the system. There was an increase in hydropower plant output, and they actually stopped their pump storage assets as they were receiving instructions from the energy system operator at that time to stabilize the grid and replace that missing energy. And this data was provided at the settlement period. So, it shows sort of that forecast in the dotted, as well as the actual output in the pink for the pump storage assets that were able to shift from pumping to generating as required by the grid to reduce the system incident, as it were. And that's one of the examples of hydro being able to provide these type of services. But just to dive into it a little bit more detail, so if many governments are considering variable renewable energy targets, as they should, we would also call that they would need to consider their energy storage and flexibility. And we're seeing this happen at pace and scale in Europe. So the European Commission over the past couple of years has instigated the electricity market design, and that was started in 2023. And in 2024, they issued an amending directive and amending regulation, which calls on it within Article 19 that member states should define indicative national objectives for non-fossil flexibility. And it requires transmission system operators and distribution system operators to report their flexibility needs every few years. So this is aimed at making sure that the member states are planning for the energy storage and flexibility needs that they need now, so that if there's incidents in the future, they're able to respond accordingly. So the deadline for EU countries to transpose these national laws was this past January. And as part of this, ENSOE has issued a methodology to support both the electricity system needs reporting as well as the network distribution. And we see this as a positive, potentially positive for hydro, because there's a great deal of hydro in the European Union, and there's potential opportunities both for modernization as well as for greenfields where appropriate, of course, aligning with ESG good and best practice. And so as part of this, the methodology report notes that network flexibility needs are local. They're locally time specific. And because congestion occurs, as Abhishek was just talking about it, there's that operational limit that's needed to be planned for and considered. So it's really important, and it's wonderful to see the European Commission and ENSOE planning for flexibility and energy storage needs. And as part of this, we should flag that actually over the past few years, many of the hydropower operators, as well as the greater hydropower industry, have been participating and supporting a number of areas in which to increase research and good practice. This includes an initiative known as the ESMAP Hydro, which actually focused on 6 case studies where you could potentially increase flexibility with some minimal increases or funding to the existing assets to better support the assets in providing various grid services. And it also showcased that they were able to prove their abilities at providing these various frequency control services, including, so you have a generic hydropower project. If it was to align with many of these and using the smart power plant, they would be able to increase their potential ancillary services that they're able to provide. And so I would strongly encourage anyone who is interested to check out the ESMAP Hydropower website, which provides immense detail on all of these areas. And I understand that there will be an ESMAP speaker, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but just to say that hydropower of any type is able to provide many and most of these services, and especially with a huge existing fleet that we have in, say, North America, in Europe, and beyond. There are these opportunities for modernization that will allow hydropower of run-of-river, reservoir storage, or pump storage to provide these very, very critical ancillary services. And as Abhishek said, it can have potentially reduce the wear and tear on the runners, which is really great. It means that it's prolonged life and it's less potential capex in future. So just to flag this, and I would strongly recommend, as noted at the reservoir storage, they were able to increase the operating range extension below minimum power, and they were able to further increase the maintenance, so they didn't have to do maintenance as frequently, and they're still able to provide many of the services or go beyond. In addition, so I would strongly encourage anyone to read the full final report, which I'll post in the chat shortly hereafter. But I've just included 2 examples from Gran Maison and Alto Rendoso. But these are fantastic examples, and I'm sure the ESMAP speaker will be very, very good as well. And they're able to successfully trial, for example, hydraulic short circuit, which meant they're able to store excess electricity and provide regulating services simultaneously, which is another example of hydro. being able to do. But just very quickly to wrap up, because I'm just cognizant I want to give Bente plenty of Q&A time. One of the things that Abhishek touched on is that longer term energy storage. So we've heard short term, and hydro of any type is able to provide that short term flexibility. But that longer term, where we're seeing governments start to consider capacity or availability, one of the examples is in Switzerland, where they, in 2022, 2023, they recognized that need for longer duration energy storage. And because they have a huge existing hydropower fleet in Switzerland, they were able to put together an ordinance and award contracts for reserve power plants and to potentially extend 3 power plants in particular with reserves and aggregated poolers across the country. Over the past 2 winters, actually they do these tenders in the summer, they did 3 tranches and they had several hundred tenders received, and of those, the total volume for the 2023-24 period was 400 gigawatt hours procured, and that they are paid for holding that water back, as it were. And then for the 2024 winter, 2025, they received a volume of 250 gigawatt hours, and it was procured at a price of 66 euros per megawatt hour. So just showing one government who's really trying to think of that longer duration energy storage and devising a market. Because ultimately, so as I've touched on a little bit here, there's a few huge opportunities, but we really do need governments involved. And governments have a very, very important role to play. But I'll touch on very, very quickly just to wrap up. So there's key opportunities to expand flexibility globally at the existing hydropower fleets. There's urgent modernization needs, which many countries and many IFIs are considering and doing great work supporting. And this will potentially have the opportunity to increase the flexibility, improve the plant productivity in general. And it has a low impact, it's lower capex generally speaking, and improves the climate resilience hopefully as well. So it's a huge win-win, and this can be considered at many and all of the plants who are at the aging level. But the actions that this is kind of taken from our recent pump storage policy toolkit, but it's very much applicable to hydropower on the round, is that governments have a strong and important role to determine how much long duration energy storage they need to make sure they have that reliability answered. Identifying appropriate sites, whether that be a greenfield pump storage site where it's appropriate to do so, or modernizing of an existing asset to make sure you have increased its capabilities, developing fit for purpose permitting, whether that's appropriate, and speeding up those processes where appropriate, and implementing revenue visibility over a long period, designing electricity markets. I'm looking forward to that conversation further. And many of the services I touched on actually are not necessarily paid for. So making sure that we pay for those, that operators are being paid for providing those services. But thank you so much for the time. I will close there, and I'm looking forward to further discussion.
And thank you so much, Rebecca. It was a very good presentation, and I think that it is also a very good foundation for the discussion that we hope to continue to have here. I encourage everybody to start asking their questions in the chat, but I would also like to kick us off with one from my perspective. So in ESMAP and also from the World Bank, we do work significantly in low and middle income countries. And today we did hear about several cases from the US, but also from Europe. But the observations that I make is that it is interesting to see that all of these different countries, even if it's low and middle income countries or in high income countries, they seem to be grappling with how to address the same types of challenges when it comes to the need for flexibility in terms of a renewable energy provider, but also how that can support the power system. So one of the questions that we are then exploring is how you can evaluate a renewable energy asset, not just as electricity generation assets, but also as energy services providers that provides both electricity generation, but storage, and also contributes towards energy control. And one of the main challenges that I have observed is that there is a need to assess how you remunerate the services provided by hydropower plants in that context. So I think that electricity generation is the easiest part of it. But how do you remunerate and value energy storage and also the balancing services or ancillary, how it contributes to ancillary services? So to kick us off, then I was wondering, Abhishek, because you also mentioned, touched upon this as a part of your business case. I was wondering if, from your perspective, where do you see this discussion going into the future? I think we successfully muted the other participants, so Abhishek, over to you.
All right. But I mean, it obviously comes down to making a successful business case, right? I mean, like we presented, like we've other speakers have probably touched on this as well. Hydro is uniquely capable of providing these services across all of the time frames, right? All the way from seconds, sub-seconds to months and longer. Now, there are established products and ancillary services for a variety of these products at these different time scales. Even in certain very specific examples for things like frequency response, which I would imagine that's like the frequency responsive products in Europe, right? Which are talking about sub-seconds or seconds kinds of responses. There are a few instances, few examples. Most of it, I agree completely with Rebecca. That just basically goes unpaid for, right? All the rotating masses provide that, including hydro. But then we've seen in some examples that places like California have run short on capacity within their own system. And so they've basically outsourced it and had a contract with entities outside of their balancing area, like the Bonneville Power Administration in the US or a couple of other utilities, where they've contracted for these services with them because it's a interconnection-wide metric which is being calculated. So anyone within the interconnection can provide that. So there are very specific examples, right? So it's not a widespread thing. So that there can be improvements made over there, right? But from my perspective, I think the real need, right, is in terms of the long duration stored energy, and that's where the business case is the flimsiest. We pay resources, we pay generation, or even storage to primarily generate, right? Whether it's providing ancillary services or or generating electricity. So we're paying them to generate, right? And using the arbitrage opportunities, and this is primarily diurnal arbitrage opportunities, which again are very system dependent, time dependent, depends on a lot of external factors, right? So we don't really pay storage to store, which is a prevailing concept in other commodity markets. And the example that Rebecca was showing, right, from Switzerland, is an example of paying energy storage to primarily store, right? Because if you think about it, when they're not storing and when they're not generating, they're losing revenue, and that's what the function of energy storage. That's basically it's redefining or introducing a new function, which is energy storage on par with transmission, generation, and distribution.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. And Rebecca, over to you, because I think that what Abhishek said now is that, the long duration energy storage aspect when it comes to remuneration is the most flimsiest. So from your perspective in IHA, how do you see this topic will be addressed in the future?
Thank you for the question, and I very much agree with Abhishek. It's this question of energy storage has not really been considered by many of the electricity market operators around the world. There are some markets who are starting to consider it, but we see this as quite a critical issue because, and especially in the hydropower space, that because many power assets, it's been so driven by power, this has meant that critical infrastructure, which is higher capex, longer time to build, these are not being developed. And so there's a lack of government recognition that the market on its own is not delivering. So there's definitely been, and we're seeing this, a need to reassess government's role in supporting long duration energy storage. as well as how electricity markets remunerate and consider and plan for electricity and longer duration energy storage. So I think the Swiss example is interesting because they're taking their existing assets and they're paying for it. And as part of it, there is an actual tariff that they're able to take advantage of. So the costs for the reservation of water are financed by Swiss Grids via a sort of separate power reserve tariff. When it comes to other governments, we're still trying to see this. We see some government interventions happening either at the state or national level, but we've not really seen too many in emerging markets, developing economies. But the exception is, I think, in India, they've been developing a pump storage. But they're very much an advanced economy in many senses. But in India is currently developing for the past couple of years, has been developing a pump storage policy guide in country. And as part of that, they did indicate that they would be reconsidering their electricity markets and how they could support. And they're also looking at sort of holistic, but less on the longer term energy storage, but they are recognizing the need for energy storage. So I think it's still something that needs to be worked out in many ways, Bente.
Yeah. No, thank you for those insights. And I think that with the case of India, where you have this definition now with what energy storage is and what kind of different technologies contribute to that, is also an interesting perspective to hold on that. I think that we're now going to turn our attention to our little meeting chat and dive into some of the questions. So what I also love with this webinars is that we do reveal that our participants are very much interested in the technical details as well. So first, I'm going to kick off with a question from Nicola Elms. So it's a question to you, Abhishek or Rebecca. Does the synthetic inertia provide equally as good resilience in terms of a resting frequency drop following an event as inertia from rotating machines?
Not an expert in this area, but all I can say is yes, there are examples out there, right, of and actually field studies as well, field demonstrations as well, from solar plants and wind plants providing this kind of response. But can this really happen at scale is a different question, and synchronized not just at a plant level but at the system level. And maybe maybe there are some examples from Ireland and from the Irish grid where they're experimenting with these kinds of responses. So again, maybe I should just pause there. I'm not an expert on this in this area.
I would say similar. So while I'm not an expert, I would say that this is something that is being looked into. It's still being sort of researched and considered in terms of the synchronous versus synthetic. Typically, most grids have that sort of more synchronous, but they are trialing with often in the case of battery energy storage systems, typically chemical, to see if they can have the same. And I'd say it's more the short term that they're able to do this. It's a more question for could it, that longer term storage, still question mark. But my understanding is that there have been some tests being undertaken in several key markets, including in Australia and some European markets. But there's not an associated market that actually is rewarding or looking. There are some emerging markets that are looking at synthetic or synchronous inertia services. And those are in sort of Europe or UK, where those are starting to emerge in terms of electricity is actually trying to allow bids for inertia services.
No, I think that this is a very good question, because I think it's the discussion that we will continue to hold moving into the future as well. And I think that as of now, synthetic inertia can be better and can also be worse than typical inertia in terms of providing the sought after response. So there are different opportunities for how you can integrate synthetic inertia into the technology at a renewable energy plant. And I think it's probably a webinar topic in itself, so we can definitely try and see if we can dive into that in the future. I think that we have time for one more question before we try to wrap this up today. Let me see. I think that we have a question for you, Rebecca, from Dylan Stalling. No, it was actually for Abhishek. My apologies. He asked if you have found that pump storage hydro projects find the FERC permitting and licensing process to be more onerous or lengthy compared with what is required for other generation or storage technologies.
I don't know if it's more or less. It's just different. Nuclear plants have to go through. I think they would say they have it worse. Transmission transmission, at least in the US, can be a decades-long process. I mean, if you're comparing it against batteries and lithium-ion, right, that can be like in a year or a couple of years, right? We're talking of a much smaller scale. We can pick and choose locations, which is not the case with pump storage for sure. So it's if comparable to other more similar capex kind of location constrained resources, it's not more or less. I think it's just different, right? It's probably the best way to answer that.
Great, thank you so much. As we're approaching the end of today's allotted time for our webinar, I think I'm going to now try and close this out. So I think we learned today is that there is a huge need for flexibility in power system, and there is also that need needs to be reflected in how we look at our renewable energy fleet. So we touch upon the fact that there is also a need to evaluate this in different timescales. And then that the business case for long duration energy storage is at the moment the one that needs further development and maturing before we have a strong one. And to strengthen that business case, there is a need to look at it also from both regulatory, policy, market, and or remuneration aspect. This, of course, based in the fact that we, with the introduction and higher shares of variable renewables in the power system, the occurrence of Dunkelflaute event is probably going to increase. There may be an increased need to curtail renewable energy. It could also give you benefits in terms of how you can explore utilizing surplus generation from renewables. So with that, I like to thank everybody for joining us here today. And then we already look forward to our next webinar. And please do stay tuned for the announcement when we come to that. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.